The gunshot was louder than the scream. It echoed through the kitchen tiles and shattered the porcelain bowl at Lena's feet before her body even hit the floor. Daniel was still holding the revolver when he realized his hands were not shaking, which frightened him more than the blood spreading under her shoulder. He had meant to scare her, to make her understand that walking away was not something she could simply decide over breakfast. Instead, the bullet lodged in the cabinet behind her, after tearing through skin and muscle, and the silence that followed was thick enough to suffocate him. "Call an ambulance," Lena whispered, her voice brittle, her palm pressed uselessly against the wound. Daniel stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. He had imagined 100 confrontations in his head, each one ending with her crying, apologizing, promising she would stay. None of them included the metallic smell now invading his lungs, or the way her eyes refused to look at him. When he finally moved, it was not toward the phone, but toward the sink, where he began washing his hands as if dirt, not blood, covered them. "You did this," she said, and there was no hysteria in her tone, only confirmation. Daniel turned the faucet off slowly and answered, "You forced me." He believed it in that moment, because believing anything else would mean accepting that the violence had originated entirely within him. The ambulance sirens grew louder outside, and he found himself rehearsing a version of the story in which the gun had gone off by accident, in which he was still the protector and not the threat. When the paramedics burst through the door, he stepped back, already positioning his face into something that resembled panic instead of calculation. At the hospital, Lena refused to let him touch her. She lay in the sterile white bed with tubes snaking into her arm, her shoulder bandaged, and stared at the ceiling as if it were more trustworthy than her husband. Daniel sat beside her, hands folded, repeating, "It was a mistake," until the words lost meaning. Every time he spoke, she flinched slightly, and that small involuntary movement struck him harder than any accusation. He had always told himself that control was a form of love, that guiding her choices kept her safe from the world's cruelty, but the monitors beeping steadily beside her told a different story. When the police officer entered the room, Daniel felt a pulse of heat crawl up his neck. The officer's questions were calm, almost gentle, and Lena's answers were shorter than they needed to be. "He didn't mean to," she said at first. And Daniel felt relief bloom in his chest like a reprieve. Then she added, "But he pointed it at me." The officer's pen paused mid-air, and Daniel understood that the narrative he had constructed was already cracking. "You said it was unloaded," Lena continued without looking at him. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, to remind her of the countless evenings he had warned her not to challenge him, not to test him. But he stopped. Those memories were not defenses, they were evidence. The officer's eyes shifted between them, measuring the distance on the bed, as if it were a map of something more permanent. After she was discharged, Lena did not return home. She went to her sister's apartment across town, leaving Daniel alone, with the shattered bowl still on the kitchen floor. He did not clean it immediately. Instead, he stood in the doorway and replayed the moment before the gunshot, trying to locate the exact second when his intention had mutated into harm. He told himself that she had been threatening to leave for months, that her silence at dinner, her late nights at work, her locked phone, were provocations. If she had just reassured him once, he thought, if she had just admitted she needed him, none of this would have happened. That night, he called her 27 times. She answered on the 28th. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice flat. Daniel swallowed and said, "I want my wife back." There was a pause, and in that pause he imagined her sister standing nearby, listening, judging. "You don't want me," Lena replied. "You want ownership." He laughed softly, trying to make the accusation sound absurd, but it echoed in his head long after she hung up. 2 days later, he was served with a temporary restraining order. The paper felt thin in his hands, almost fragile, but the words printed on it carried a weight he could not ignore. He was prohibited from contacting her, from approaching her workplace, from stepping within 200 meters of her sister's building. Daniel read the document 3 times, searching for loopholes as if it were a contract he could renegotiate. Instead, he found only the undeniable fact that the state now recognized him as a threat. He called his friend Marcus that evening, needing someone to validate his version of events. Marcus listened quietly as Daniel described the argument, the gun, the accidental discharge. "You've always been intense," Marcus said carefully. "Maybe she just got scared." Daniel bristled at the word scared, as if it diminished him. "I was protecting what's mine," he insisted. Marcus did not respond immediately, and that silence felt like betrayal. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's world narrowed. He stopped going to work after his manager suggested he take time off to sort things out. He stopped answering calls from anyone who mentioned Lena's name with sympathy. Instead, He began driving past her sister's street at night, parking 2 blocks away, and watching the lit windows. He told himself he was only ensuring she was safe, that the city was dangerous, that she did not understand how vulnerable she was without him. Each time he saw her silhouette move behind the curtains, his chest tightened with a mix of longing and resentment. One evening, he noticed another figure in the apartment, taller, broader. The man leaned close to Lena as they spoke, and Daniel felt a rush of cold fury that eclipsed every rational thought. "Already," he muttered to himself. "Already you replace me." He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, convinced that the universe was mocking him. He did not consider that the man might be a coworker, a cousin, a neighbor. He decided instantly that he was a rival. The next morning, Daniel broke the restraining order. He waited outside her workplace, standing across the street where he knew she would see him. When she stepped out during lunch and noticed him, her face drained of color. She approached cautiously, stopping several meters away, as if an invisible barrier separated them. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. "I needed to see you," he replied, forcing softness into his tone. "Who was that man last night?" Lena blinked, confusion quickly replaced by anger. "You're watching me," she said, and the words were not a question. Daniel stepped forward, closing some of the distance, and lowered his voice. "Answer me." "It was my lawyer," she said, each syllable deliberate. "I'm filing for divorce." The word struck him like a second gunshot, louder than the first. He felt the ground tilt slightly beneath his feet, as if gravity itself had shifted sides. "You can't," he whispered, not as a plea but as a command. "I already did," Lena replied. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The certainty in her posture, the absence of apology, felt like an erasure of everything he believed they were. Daniel's mind raced through strategies, through threats disguised as promises, through memories he could weaponize. "After everything I've done for you," he said, his tone sharpening despite himself. "You shot me," she answered. The simplicity of the statement stripped away all his justifications. People nearby began to glance in their direction, sensing tension. Lena took a step back. "If you come near me again, I'll make sure you're arrested." She turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing on the pavement, exposed and powerless. That night, he returned to the house and finally cleaned the broken bowl. As he swept the shards into a dustpan, he imagined sweeping away the version of himself that had lost control. He began drafting a long message he could not legally send, explaining how her departure had destabilized him, how fear had masqueraded as anger. He described childhood memories of abandonment, of a mother who left without explanation, and a father who taught him that dominance was survival. In writing, he almost convinced himself that he was a product of circumstance rather than choice. He did not send the message. Instead, he printed it and folded it carefully, placing it in the drawer beside the bed where Lena used to sleep. The empty half of the mattress felt colder each night, and he started sleeping on her side, as if proximity to her absence could fill the void. He told himself he would change, that he would attend therapy, that he would prove to the court he was not the monster she was painting him to be. Yet beneath those intentions simmered a quieter, darker thought. If he could not have her, no one else would. Weeks passed, and the court date approached. Daniel's lawyer advised him to show remorse, to avoid confrontation, to present himself as a man struggling with stress rather than rage. "Judges respond to humility," she said, tapping her pen against a legal pad. Daniel nodded, rehearsing expressions in the mirror at home. He practiced lowering his gaze, softening his jaw, modulating his voice into something that resembled regret. On the day of the hearing, Lena avoided eye contact entirely. She sat beside her attorney, hands clasped tightly, her bandaged shoulder now healed but still tender. When the judge asked Daniel if he understood the severity of his actions, he replied, "Yes, Your Honor." With a tone so controlled it bordered on mechanical. He spoke about therapy sessions he had scheduled but not yet attended, about his commitment to nonviolence, about his love for his wife. Lena was then asked if she felt safe. She inhaled slowly before answering, "Not yet." The 2 words hung in the courtroom like a verdict more powerful than any legal ruling. Daniel felt anger rise in him again, hot and immediate, but he forced it down because any visible reaction would confirm her fear. The judge extended the restraining order and scheduled further evaluation, emphasizing the importance of distance. Outside the courthouse, Daniel watched Lena walk away with her lawyer. He noticed how straight her back was, how deliberate her steps seemed. For the first time, he recognized something he had refused to see. She was not fragile. The narrative in which he was her guardian had always been a convenient illusion. The realization did not soften him. It threatened him. That evening, he received a call from Marcus. "You need to let her go," his friend said, without preamble. Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the spot where the bullet had pierced the cabinet. "You don't understand," he replied. "If I let her go, then what was all of this for?" Marcus hesitated. "Maybe that's the wrong question." Daniel ended the call abruptly. He walked to the bedroom and opened the drawer containing the unsent letter. He unfolded the pages and reread his own words, searching for sincerity among the self-pity. He wondered whether love could exist without possession, whether protection could exist without control. The questions unsettled him because they implied that he had never truly loved her, only feared losing her. As midnight approached, his phone buzzed with a notification from social media. A photo of Lena appeared on his screen, posted by her sister. She was smiling, her arm around a group of friends, her shoulder no longer bandaged. Daniel zoomed in on her face, analyzing the curve of her lips for signs of forced happiness. He told himself the smile was brittle, that he could detect strain, but the image contradicted him. He placed the phone down slowly and sat in the darkness. For a brief moment, he imagined walking away entirely, moving to another city, starting over where no one knew what he had done. The thought felt like surrender. Instead, he began drafting a different plan, one that would not involve weapons or public confrontations. He would find a way to prove she still needed him, to create circumstances in which his presence would appear indispensable. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. "You'll see," he murmured, though there was no one to hear him. The house around him felt less like a home and more like a stage waiting for the next act. He believed he was regaining control by thinking strategically, but he failed to notice that each calculated thought pushed him further from redemption. The silence in the room deepened, not peaceful but anticipatory, as if the consequences of his decisions were gathering just beyond the walls. He believed he was regaining control by thinking strategically, but he failed to notice that each calculated thought pushed him further from redemption. The silence in the room deepened, not peaceful but anticipatory, as if the consequences of his decisions were gathering just beyond the walls. He told himself that strategy was not manipulation, that influence was not coercion, that what he was about to do would simply restore balance to something that had unfairly tilted against him. The next morning, Daniel scheduled an appointment with a therapist recommended by his lawyer. He arrived early, dressed carefully in neutral colors, rehearsing vulnerability in the reflection of his car window. When the therapist, Dr. Halpern, invited him inside, Daniel immediately began describing his childhood, emphasizing instability, fear, the unpredictability of his mother's departure. He spoke in measured tones about abandonment trauma, about how Lena's threat to leave had triggered something primal in him. Dr. Halpern listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes. "And the gun?" she asked finally. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if the question exhausted him. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said. "I just needed her to understand how serious I was." The therapist's eyes did not soften. "You equated seriousness with fear," she replied. "That's not misunderstanding. That's conditioning." Daniel felt irritation flicker beneath his calm expression. He had expected empathy, perhaps cautious agreement. Instead, he encountered something closer to accountability. "I was protecting my marriage," he insisted. Dr. Halpern leaned back slightly. "From what?" The simplicity of the question disarmed him. He paused longer than he intended to. "From losing her," he admitted. "Or from losing control?" she asked gently. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment he considered ending the session, but he forced himself to remain seated, because leaving would look unstable, and instability was now his greatest enemy. "Isn't control part of commitment?" he asked instead. "Commitment involves consent," Dr. Halpern replied. "Control removes it." The words lodged somewhere inside him, uncomfortable and immovable. He left the office with a new layer of anger he could not openly display, resentment not only toward Lena, but toward anyone who refused to validate his narrative. That evening, he drove past her sister's building again despite knowing it was a violation. He parked farther away this time, careful not to be seen. The lights were on in the living room, and through the thin curtains he could see Lena seated at a table with the same tall man. Papers were spread between them. Daniel imagined divorce documents, financial discussions, division of assets. He imagined his name being dissected in legal language. He pulled out his phone and began recording from a distance, as if documentation would somehow empower him. "You're planning without me," he muttered under his breath. "You're rewriting our life." The jealousy he felt was no longer about romance. It was about erasure. He could tolerate anger, even betrayal, but irrelevance terrified him. When Lena suddenly stood and walked toward the window, Daniel instinctively ducked lower in his seat. For a moment, He feared she had sensed him, that some invisible thread still connected them, but she merely closed the curtains completely. The gesture felt deliberate, even if it was not. He interpreted it as rejection, as a statement that he no longer had access. The following week, Daniel received notice that Lena was requesting exclusive occupancy of the house during divorce proceedings. The document cited emotional distress and safety concerns. Reading it, Daniel felt a mixture of humiliation and disbelief. "It's my house," he said aloud to no one. "I paid the mortgage." Yet beneath the indignation lurked a quieter fear that perhaps he would lose even the physical space that had anchored his identity. He called his lawyer immediately. "We can contest it," she said, "but given the restraining order, the optics aren't in your favor." Daniel hated the word optics. It implied that perception mattered more than intention. "She's manipulating the system," he argued. His lawyer sighed softly. "Daniel, you fired a gun at her." He ended the call abruptly and paced the living room. The walls felt closer, as if the house itself were shrinking. He began imagining scenarios in which Lena realized the legal process was too exhausting, too expensive, and decided reconciliation was simpler. He drafted another message he could not send, this one more strategic than emotional. It outlined financial consequences, the stress of litigation, the public embarrassment of a drawn-out divorce. He folded that letter too and placed it beside the first. His drawer was becoming a museum of unsent control. Days later, he received an unexpected call from Lena's sister, Maya. Her voice was calm but firm. "We need to talk," she said. Daniel hesitated, aware that contact with anyone close to Lena could be scrutinized. "About what?" he asked cautiously. "About you driving past the apartment," she replied. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied reflexively. Maya exhaled slowly. "There are security cameras on the street now. You're not as subtle as you think." For a moment, panic flickered through him, sharp and electric. "I was just in the area," he said weakly. "Stop," Maya interrupted. "You're making this worse. She's scared." The word again, scared, as if Lena were a child and he were a monster from a bedtime story. "I would never hurt her," Daniel insisted, even as he remembered the sound of the gunshot. "You already did," Maya replied quietly. The absence of anger in her voice made the statement more cutting. "If you care about her at all, you'll stop this." Daniel hung up without responding. He sat in his car for nearly an hour afterward, staring at nothing. He told himself that they were conspiring to paint him as unstable, that the cameras were excessive, that Maya was exaggerating Lena's fear to strengthen the legal case. Yet beneath the rationalizations, a crack was forming. That night, he dreamed of the kitchen again. In the dream, the gunshot never happened. Instead, Lena walked out calmly, suitcase in hand, and closed the door without looking back. Daniel tried to move, to chase her, but his feet were cemented to the floor. He woke up sweating, heart pounding, realizing that, in some ways, the absence of violence was more unbearable than the memory of it. Without the gunshot, he would have no catastrophic moment to blame, only her decision. The next therapy session was different. Dr. Halpern asked him to describe what he feared most about the divorce. Daniel opened his mouth to say loneliness, but the word felt incomplete. "Being irrelevant," he said instead. "Being replaced." The therapist nodded slightly. "So you're fighting not for her love, but for your significance." Daniel felt exposed in a way he disliked. "Does it matter?" he asked defensively. "It matters because one is mutual, and the other is possession," she replied. He looked away, staring at a framed abstract painting on the wall. He wondered whether he had ever asked Lena what she wanted, without filtering the answer through his own needs. As the weeks progressed, court-mandated evaluations intensified. Daniel underwent anger management classes where other men recounted stories of restraining orders and custody battles. He listened silently, refusing to see himself reflected in them. "I'm not like them," he thought. "I didn't mean to." Meanwhile, Lena filed for sole custody of their dog, a small golden retriever named Milo. The request seemed trivial compared to everything else, but it struck Daniel with unexpected force. Milo had been the one constant presence in their evenings, curling between them on the couch. Losing the dog felt symbolic, like losing the last neutral territory. He considered contesting the custody request purely out of spite. Instead, he began formulating a different idea. If he could demonstrate stability, responsibility, genuine progress in therapy, perhaps Lena would doubt her own narrative of him. He started volunteering at a local animal shelter, documenting his hours meticulously. He imagined presenting this evidence in court as proof of transformation. But even as he cleaned kennels and walked abandoned dogs, he found himself resenting the animals for not being Milo. Each wagging tail felt like a reminder that affection could be given freely elsewhere. He began posting photos of his volunteer work on social media, ensuring mutual acquaintances would see them. The captions were humble, carefully phrased to imply growth without admitting guilt. One evening, Lena commented under one of the posts with a single sentence, "Public gestures don't erase private actions." The comment accumulated sympathetic replies within minutes. Daniel stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He felt publicly corrected, diminished. He typed a response and deleted it 3 times before finally writing nothing. Silence, he decided, would appear dignified. Yet inside, resentment expanded, filling every unoccupied space. He began to view Lena not as a wounded partner, but as an adversary in a campaign to define reality. When the court granted her temporary occupancy of the house, Daniel was ordered to vacate within 72 hours. Packing his belongings felt surreal. He moved through each room methodically, avoiding eye contact with objects that carried shared memories. The kitchen cabinet with the bullet hole remained unrepaired. He chose to leave it as it was, a scar he refused to hide. As he loaded boxes into his car, he noticed a neighbor watching discreetly from across the street. Daniel forced a polite nod, aware that gossip had likely already circulated. He imagined himself described as unstable, dangerous, unpredictable. The humiliation was suffocating. He rented a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The space was clean but impersonal, its walls bare, its silence different from the house's. There were no echoes of shared laughter here, no reminders of dinners or arguments. At first, he told himself the distance would help him think clearly. Instead, it intensified his obsession. He began tracking court dates, therapy sessions, volunteer hours, as if life had become a spreadsheet he could optimize. Yet at night, lying alone in the unfamiliar bed, he replayed Lena's words repeatedly. "You don't want me. You want ownership." The accusation lingered because it contained a fragment of truth he could not fully dismiss. One afternoon, he received an email from Lena's lawyer proposing mediation. The message emphasized efficiency, mutual agreement, reduced conflict. Daniel read it several times. Mediation implied negotiation rather than battle. It also implied that Lena still saw some possibility of structured dialogue. He agreed immediately, though not for the reasons his lawyer assumed. He saw mediation as an opportunity to confront her directly in a controlled environment, to test whether any emotional residue remained. He imagined catching a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a momentary softness that would confirm he still mattered. The mediation session took place in a sterile office, with neutral carpeting, and a round table designed to minimize confrontation. Lena arrived composed, dressed simply, her posture upright. She did not greet him beyond a brief nod. The mediator outlined ground rules. No interruptions, respectful tone, focus on practical outcomes. When it was Daniel's turn to speak, he leaned forward slightly. "I never wanted this," he began. "I made a mistake, and I'm working on myself." Lena listened without visible reaction. When she responded, her voice was steady. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." The distinction unsettled him. "I was scared," he insisted. "So was I," she replied. The mediator interjected gently, steering the conversation toward asset division, but the emotional undercurrent remained. As hours passed, practical matters were addressed: bank accounts, retirement funds, furniture allocation. Each decision felt like dismantling a shared identity piece by piece. When they reached the topic of the house, Lena requested its sale. Daniel's instinct was to refuse, to anchor himself to that space. But he paused, calculating. "If it sells," he said slowly, "we both move on." The words tasted foreign. Lena studied him briefly, as if searching for hidden intent. "That's the point," she replied. By the end of the session, tentative agreements were documented. Nothing was final, but the trajectory was clear. As they stood to leave, Daniel felt an unexpected surge of desperation. "Do you ever miss me?" he asked quietly, disregarding the mediator's presence. Lena hesitated, not because she was uncertain, but because she was choosing her words carefully. "I miss who I thought you were," she said. The statement did not carry cruelty. It carried finality. Daniel watched her exit the room, realizing that the battle he believed he was fighting might already be lost. Yet, instead of surrender, he felt something else begin to form a quieter, more calculated resolve. If he could not restore the past, perhaps he could reshape the future in ways she did not anticipate. He stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the city noise distant but constant. For a brief moment, he considered allowing the process to unfold without interference. The idea felt almost peaceful. Then his phone buzzed with a notification reminding him of the next court evaluation. He looked at the screen and understood that peace was not yet available to him. Not because Lena denied it, but because he did. The realization unsettled him more than any legal threat. He slid the phone back into his pocket and began walking, uncertain whether the path ahead led toward redemption or deeper ruin, but unwilling to stand still. The air felt heavier than it should have, as if the city itself were pressing against his chest, reminding him that movement did not equal progress. He told himself that walking away from the building was symbolic, that every step forward was a step away from obsession. Yet his thoughts remained tethered to Lena, like a rope he could not cut. That night, alone in the apartment, he spread the mediation documents across his kitchen table and studied them as if searching for hidden codes. Numbers replaced memories, percentages replaced promises. He tried to reduce the marriage to arithmetic, believing that if he could solve the equation correctly, the emotional chaos would resolve into something rational. Instead, the columns blurred as his mind replayed her words. "I miss who I thought you were." He poured himself a drink, something he had avoided since therapy began, and told himself it was only to steady his thoughts. The alcohol burned down his throat and loosened the tightness in his shoulders, but it also softened the boundaries he had been trying to construct. He opened social media again, scrolling through Lena's profile despite promising himself he would stop. There were no new photos, no direct references to him, only ordinary updates about work and friends. The normalcy felt like a betrayal. "You're fine," he muttered at the screen. "You're completely fine." He wanted to see cracks, evidence of regret, some signal that she struggled without him. The absence of visible suffering felt like erasure. He set the phone face down, but the image of her composed expression lingered. The next evaluation required him to meet with a court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Ramirez, whose office was less forgiving than Dr. Halpern's. The questions were direct, clinical. "Describe the moment you pulled the trigger, doctor," Ramirez said, without hesitation. Daniel felt irritation rise at the bluntness. "It wasn't like that," he replied. "It wasn't deliberate." The psychologist did not nod sympathetically. "Intent and impact are separate," she said. "I'm asking about your mental state." Daniel described fear, adrenaline, the overwhelming need to be heard. He framed it as a loss of control triggered by emotional abandonment. "Did you believe she might die?" Dr. Ramirez asked calmly. Daniel hesitated. The image of Lena collapsing had not included death in his imagination, only compliance. "No," he answered, though uncertainty flickered. "So the risk was acceptable to you," she observed. The statement unsettled him because it exposed something he had refused to articulate. Risk had been secondary to dominance in that moment. He shifted in his chair. "I didn't think," he said finally. "Exactly," Dr. Ramirez replied. When the session ended, Daniel felt stripped of his rehearsed narrative. Dr. Halpern had offered reflection. Dr. Ramirez offered dissection. He left with the uncomfortable sense that professional neutrality did not guarantee absolution. A few days later, Lena requested a modification to the restraining order, citing his presence near her apartment and workplace. Daniel received the notice with a mix of anger and fear. He wanted to argue that he had not approached her directly, that he had only observed from a distance, but he understood how weak that defense would sound. Observation without consent was still intrusion. He considered retaliating legally, perhaps alleging defamation, but his lawyer advised caution. "You're already on thin ice," she said. "Any escalation could damage your case further." Daniel nodded reluctantly, feeling increasingly cornered by the consequences of his own actions. One evening, Marcus visited the apartment unannounced. He looked around at the sparse furniture and bare walls, his expression somewhere between concern and frustration. "This isn't you," Marcus said quietly. Daniel shrugged. "Temporary." Marcus sat down across from him. "You keep saying that. Temporary house. Temporary separation. Temporary restraining order. What if it's not temporary?" The question hung heavy between them. Daniel felt defensive instinctively. "It doesn't have to be permanent," he replied. If she'd just what?" Marcus interrupted gently. "Forgive you. Forget it happened. Pretend she wasn't bleeding on your kitchen floor." The bluntness stung, but Daniel forced himself not to react visibly. "You're supposed to be on my side," he said. Marcus leaned forward. "I am. That's why I'm telling you this. You're losing yourself trying to control something that's already gone." The word "gone" echoed unpleasantly. Daniel looked away. "You think I'm a monster too," he said quietly. Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think you did something monstrous. That doesn't have to define you, but denying it will." After Marcus left, Daniel sat alone for a long time. The apartment felt smaller than before, the walls less neutral and more accusatory. He opened the drawer beside his bed, where he had placed copies of the unsent letters he had brought with him from the house. He reread them again, noticing how each page centered his own pain more than Lena's. For the first time, he tried writing a different kind of letter, one that did not justify or strategize. He began with, "I am responsible." The sentence felt foreign, almost dangerous. He continued slowly, acknowledging fear without weaponizing it, acknowledging harm without minimizing it. The act of writing without defensiveness left him exposed in a way that strategy never had. He did not send this letter either. He folded it and placed it with the others, uncertain whether restraint was maturity or cowardice. Weeks passed, and mediation progressed toward final agreements. The house was listed for sale. Strangers began walking through rooms that once held intimate arguments and quiet reconciliations. Daniel avoided attending showings, unable to tolerate the idea of unfamiliar footsteps in those spaces. Instead, he received updates via email. Each one, another reminder that the past was being itemized and liquidated. One afternoon, he received a call from the real estate agent informing him that an offer had been made. The price was reasonable. Lena had already agreed. Daniel felt a surge of resistance, an urge to reject the offer, simply to delay the inevitable. "If we refuse, it could take months," the agent warned. He stared at the bullet hole in the cabinet during the call, imagining future owners patching it, repainting, erasing evidence. "Accept it," he said finally. The decision felt like signing away, not just property but narrative control. That evening, Lena sent a brief email confirming her agreement. There was no emotional commentary, only logistical clarity. Daniel reread the message several times, searching for subtext. There was none. The absence of hostility felt almost colder than anger. He attended another therapy session the following day and described the sale. "How do you feel about it?" Dr. Halpern asked. Daniel hesitated. "Like I'm being edited out," he admitted. The therapist nodded slowly. "Or like you're being forced to see that you are not the sole author of the story." The metaphor unsettled him. He had always viewed himself as the architect of their life, the decision-maker, the stabilizer. Accepting co-authorship implied limits to his authority. "If I'm not in control," he said, "then what am I?" "A participant," she replied simply. The word lingered with him long after the session ended. Participant suggested vulnerability, negotiation, unpredictability. It also suggested that outcomes were not solely his responsibility, nor solely his entitlement. As the divorce moved closer to finalization, Daniel noticed a shift in himself that he did not entirely trust. The obsessive surveillance lessened, not because he felt resolved, but because exhaustion had begun to dull his edges. He still thought about Lena constantly, but the thoughts were less explosive and more reflective. One evening, he received a text from an unknown number. For a brief, irrational second, he hoped it was Lena, using a different phone. Instead, it was from a colleague informing him that a promotion opportunity had opened at work, contingent on his return and stable conduct. The message surprised him. He had almost forgotten the existence of professional ambition. He considered ignoring it, continuing to orbit solely around the divorce. But something about the possibility of advancement sparked a faint curiosity. "Maybe I can rebuild elsewhere," he thought. Though the idea felt premature, he scheduled a meeting with his manager and returned to the office for the first time in months. The environment felt both familiar and distant. Colleagues greeted him cautiously, aware of rumors but unsure of details. Daniel forced himself to engage professionally, focusing on tasks rather than personal narrative. During a quiet moment at his desk, he realized that for several consecutive hours, he had not thought about Lena. The realization startled him more than any confrontation had. It felt like betrayal, as if forgetting her even briefly diminished the significance of their history. Yet it also felt like relief. Later that week, the court finalized the divorce. The proceeding was brief, procedural, devoid of dramatic confrontation. Daniel and Lena stood in the same room, separated by quiet acknowledgement rather than hostility. When the judge declared the marriage legally dissolved, Daniel expected to feel devastation. Instead, he felt something quieter, heavier. Outside the courthouse, they exchanged a final glance. There was no embrace, no dramatic declaration. Lena's expression was neither cruel nor nostalgic. It was resolute. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. He almost replied with something defensive, something that would reassert significance. Instead, he nodded. "You too." The simplicity of the exchange felt both insufficient and necessary. As she walked away, Daniel noticed that the urge to chase her was absent. The absence did not signal peace. It signaled recognition. The chapter, however painful, had closed without his consent, yet also without his intervention. That night, alone in his apartment, he opened the drawer containing the unsent letters. He spread them across the bed and read each one slowly. The early letters dripped with justification and control. The later ones contained more accountability, though still tinged with self-protection. He considered burning them as a symbolic gesture. Instead, he placed them back in the drawer. Destruction felt theatrical. Preservation felt honest. He lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The silence in the room was different now, less anticipatory and more uncertain. He understood that consequences would continue to ripple outward social perceptions, professional scrutiny, internal guilt. There was no clean resolution, no redemptive sacrifice to erase what had happened. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that growth did not require her return. The thought was fragile, easily threatened by loneliness, but it existed. He did not frame it as victory or defeat. He framed it as continuation. His phone buzzed again, a notification from the animal shelter thanking volunteers for their dedication. He stared at the message, realizing that small acts of consistency might matter more than grand gestures of control. The idea did not absolve him, but it offered direction. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. They no longer felt like witnesses to his failure. They felt indifferent. The indifference was unsettling but also liberating. The world continued, regardless of his internal storms. He inhaled slowly, aware that redemption, if it existed, would not arrive dramatically. It would accumulate quietly, decision by decision. He was not at peace. He was not absolved. He was not fully transformed. But for the first time since the gunshot, he was no longer strategizing how to reclaim what was lost. He was contemplating how to live with it. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, and he distrusted it immediately, as if any movement toward stability might be temporary or self-deceptive. He had built so much of his identity around reaction that the absence of immediate conflict felt like standing in an unfamiliar landscape. The weeks after the divorce finalized were not dramatic. There were no sudden revelations, no cinematic breakdowns. Instead, there was repetition. Work in the mornings, therapy in the afternoons, volunteering at the shelter on weekends. The structure felt artificial at first, like scaffolding around a building still damaged inside. Yet repetition began to quiet the part of his mind that constantly searched for threats. At work, he focused obsessively on performance. He arrived early, stayed late, avoided personal conversations. He sensed colleagues watching him differently, as if measuring his volatility against his composure. When a disagreement arose in a meeting about a project deadline, he felt the familiar surge of heat in his chest. The impulse to dominate the conversation, to assert authority sharply, flickered. Instead, he paused. He forced himself to listen. The pause felt unnatural, like holding his breath underwater. When he responded, his tone was controlled but not aggressive. The room did not tense the way it might have months earlier. The meeting ended without escalation. He returned to his desk and sat still for several seconds. The moment seemed trivial, but to him it felt like evidence that control did not have to equal intimidation. The realization unsettled him because it implied that he had always had alternatives. Therapy sessions shifted as well. Dr. Halpern began asking fewer questions about Lena and more about his patterns in broader contexts. "You equated vulnerability with weakness," she said during one session. "That belief didn't start with your marriage." Daniel nodded reluctantly. He spoke more openly now about his father's rigid expectations, about the way mistakes were punished with silence rather than guidance. He described learning early that fear was leverage, that being feared meant being secure. As he articulated these memories, he noticed how often he framed them as explanations rather than excuses. "Understanding origin doesn't erase responsibility," Dr. Halpern reminded him gently. Daniel no longer bristled at the statement. Instead, he felt its weight settle into something he could carry. One evening, as he left the shelter, he saw Lena unexpectedly. She was standing near the entrance with a small crate in her hands. For a split second, his body reacted before his mind did. A flash of adrenaline, a tightening of muscles prepared for confrontation. Then he noticed the crate contained a thin gray cat, its eyes wide and cautious. She saw him at the same moment. There was a flicker of surprise in her expression, followed by something calmer. "I didn't know you volunteered here," she said evenly. Daniel swallowed. "I didn't know you did either." There was no hostility in her tone, only distance. The air between them was not charged with unresolved passion. It was careful, measured. "I'm fostering her," Lena explained, glancing at the cat. "Temporary." The word struck him unexpectedly. "I remember you always said you preferred dogs," he replied before he could stop himself. She gave a faint, almost amused smile. "People change." The statement carried no accusation, but it landed heavily. They stood in silence for a few seconds. He resisted the urge to fill it with apology or explanation. Instead, he said simply, "She looks scared." Lena nodded. "She is. But she'll adjust." He understood the metaphor without it being spoken aloud. "Take care," she said softly before walking past him. He did not follow. He did not call after her. He watched her leave, noticing that the encounter had not destabilized him the way it once would have. It unsettled him, yes, but it did not ignite the old fury. Later that night, he replayed the interaction repeatedly, analyzing his own reactions. There had been no possessiveness, no demand, only recognition of change. He was unsure whether that signaled growth or resignation. Months passed, the house sold, and the funds were distributed. The bullet hole was likely patched by now, painted over, absorbed into neutrality. The thought no longer made him defensive, it made him reflective. Scars could be covered, but they did not disappear. They became part of the structure. At work, he received the promotion he had been quietly pursuing. The acknowledgement felt earned rather than strategic. During the announcement, he noticed a flicker of pride that did not rely on external control. It was quieter, less performative. Yet progress did not eliminate consequence. The restraining order remained active for its full duration. He complied without testing boundaries. He deleted Lena from social media entirely. Not as a grand gesture, but as a practical step. Each boundary respected felt like a small repair, though not redemption. One evening, Marcus invited him to dinner with a small group of friends. Daniel hesitated, aware that social environments once triggered his need to dominate conversation. He agreed anyway. At the restaurant, he listened more than he spoke. When someone asked about his divorce, he did not deflect with humor or blame. He said simply, "I hurt someone I loved. I'm working on not repeating that." The honesty startled even him. The table grew quiet for a moment before conversation resumed. There was no dramatic condemnation, no dramatic absolution, just acknowledgement. Later, Marcus pulled him aside. "You sound different," he said. Daniel shrugged slightly. "Maybe I am." Marcus studied him. "Different doesn't mean fixed," he cautioned. Daniel nodded. "I know." Therapy eventually shifted toward future relationships. The idea felt premature and uncomfortable. "You don't have to pursue anything," Dr. Halpern clarified, "but you need to understand how you would approach it differently." Daniel struggled with the concept. He had equated intensity with devotion, jealousy with commitment. Untangling those beliefs felt like dismantling core parts of his personality. He began noticing subtle impulses in everyday interactions: impatience when a colleague disagreed, irritation when a friend canceled plans. Each impulse became a small test. One afternoon, he received an email from Lena. It was brief and logistical. She had found an old document of his among her files and asked where to send it. The neutrality of the message was almost clinical. He responded politely, providing his address without embellishment. When the envelope arrived days later, he opened it slowly. Inside was a life insurance policy they had once discussed updating. The paperwork felt symbolic, a reminder of a future they had once planned. He sat at his kitchen table holding the document, recognizing that the future had not ended, only changed direction. He did not interpret her email as an invitation. He did not read hidden longing into it. The restraint felt intentional rather than forced. One night, months later, he dreamed again of the kitchen. This time, the gunshot still occurred, but instead of freezing, he dropped the weapon immediately. He knelt beside Lena and called for help. The dream did not rewrite history. It offered an alternate reaction. He woke unsettled, but not panicked. In therapy, he described the dream. "Your mind is rehearsing responsibility," Dr. Halpern observed. Daniel considered that. The idea that responsibility could be rehearsed, strengthened like a muscle, was unfamiliar but plausible. As the restraining order's expiration approached, he felt a mixture of anticipation and caution. The legal boundary had structured his behavior. Without it, he would have to rely entirely on internal limits. The absence of prohibition would be its own test. On the day it expired, he noticed the date quietly. There was no ceremony, no notification beyond his own awareness. He did not call Lena. He did not drive past her apartment. The lack of action felt more significant than any dramatic gesture could have been. Weeks later, he saw her again, by coincidence, at a grocery store. She was alone, examining produce. The encounter was mundane, almost ordinary. She noticed him and paused briefly. There was no visible fear in her expression, but there was caution. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi." The exchange was simple. He did not step closer than necessary. He did not ask intrusive questions. They spoke briefly about neutral topics: the shelter, work, the weather. "I heard you got promoted," she said after a moment. He nodded. "Yeah." There was no sarcasm in her tone. "That's good," she added. For a fleeting second, he felt the urge to apologize again, to reopen the past in hopes of cleansing it. Instead, he said, "I'm trying to do better." She studied him, not skeptically, not warmly, but thoughtfully. "I hope you are," she replied. The words were not an endorsement, they were a boundary. As they parted, Daniel felt something unfamiliar. Not longing, not anger, something closer to acceptance, though not complete. He understood that even if she eventually felt safe around him, the history would never dissolve entirely. That evening, he returned to his apartment and opened the drawer one final time. He reread the letters again, noticing how distant the earliest ones felt. He no longer recognized the man who wrote them with the same intensity. He did not destroy them. He left them as reminders. He sat on his bed and reflected on the path from that morning in the kitchen to this quiet night. The damage remained real. The consequences remained irreversible. Growth had not erased harm. It had merely changed his response to it. He understood now that control had been a shield against vulnerability. Without it, he felt exposed, uncertain, but also less violent. The absence of dramatic closure felt honest. Redemption, if it existed, was not a destination but a practice. He lay back and stared at the ceiling, aware that the story did not end here. It continued in daily decisions, in restrained impulses, in small acts of accountability. He was not absolved. He was not condemned beyond repair. He was in the middle. Not at the beginning where denial could still distort memory into self-defense, and not at the end where forgiveness, if it ever came, would feel earned. The middle was quieter and more dangerous because it offered no dramatic confrontation to react against. It required endurance. The weeks that followed felt almost deceptively stable. Work demanded attention. Therapy demanded honesty. The shelter demanded patience. Routine became both anchor and mirror. Without chaos to push against, Daniel began to notice subtler fractures inside himself, the ones that had never needed a gunshot to exist. One afternoon at the office, a junior analyst missed a deadline on a project Daniel was overseeing. The mistake was minor, easily corrected, but it triggered something disproportionate in him. He felt heat rise in his throat, the familiar urge to intimidate, to make the analyst feel small enough that the mistake would never happen again. He imagined the tone he used to take in similar situations, measured but sharp, authoritative enough to silence resistance. Instead, he forced himself to step away from the desk. He walked to the break room, poured a glass of water, and stood still until the surge passed. When he returned, he addressed the analyst calmly, outlining the correction without raising his voice. The analyst nodded gratefully. Tension diffused before it had a chance to escalate. The restraint did not feel heroic. It felt exhausting. That night, Daniel admitted in therapy that not reacting violently, emotionally, or verbally required constant vigilance. "It's easier to dominate," he said. "It's faster." Dr. Halpern nodded. "Yes, but faster isn't healthier. You're learning to tolerate discomfort instead of discharging it." The phrase lingered with him. Tolerate discomfort. He had built his entire emotional system around eliminating discomfort immediately. If he felt threatened, he controlled. If he felt ignored, he demanded. If he felt insecure, he asserted dominance. Sitting with discomfort felt like weakness, until he began to recognize it as discipline. Months continued to pass. Lena remained present in his mind, but no longer at the center. He heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved into a different apartment across town. He did not ask for details. He did not search public records. The restraint felt less forced now, and more habitual. One evening at the shelter, he noticed a volunteer named Elise struggling to calm an anxious dog. The dog barked sharply whenever someone approached the kennel, teeth bared not in aggression but fear. Daniel watched from a distance at first, recognizing something familiar in the animal's posture. "He won't stop," Elise said quietly as Daniel approached. "He snaps at everyone." Daniel crouched slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "He's not snapping," he said. "He's warning." The dog growled, muscles tense. Daniel did not reach forward immediately. He simply remained still, allowing the dog to observe him. After several minutes, the growl softened slightly. The dog did not approach, but he did not retreat either. "You're not forcing it," Elise observed. Daniel shook his head. "If I force it, he'll bite, and he'll think he had to." The words felt heavier than the moment required. Over the next weeks, Daniel worked consistently with the dog, gradually building trust through patience rather than authority. The process was slow and often frustrating. There were setbacks. There were moments when the dog lunged unexpectedly. Each time, Daniel resisted the instinct to assert control physically. Instead, he reset, breathed, and tried again. The shelter manager eventually suggested that Daniel consider adopting the dog. The idea unsettled him. Ownership once equaled identity for him. Now, the word adoption felt different, less about possession and more about responsibility. He hesitated for several days before agreeing. When he brought the dog home, He chose the name Atlas, not for strength, but for endurance. The apartment felt less hollow with another presence inside it, though the responsibility carried weight. Atlas required structure, calm, boundaries that were firm but not aggressive. One night, as Atlas lay curled near the couch, Daniel realized he had not thought about Lena for hours. The absence of her in his immediate consciousness did not feel like betrayal anymore. It felt like space. Yet growth did not erase memory. On the anniversary of the gunshot, the date surfaced in his calendar unexpectedly. He had not marked it intentionally. It appeared because of an old shared reminder that had not been deleted. Seeing the date sent a tremor through him. He considered ignoring it. Instead, he took the day off work and scheduled an extended therapy session. In the session, he described the memory in detail, not as a narrative of fear, but as a narrative of harm. He described the sound, the smell, Lena's expression. He did not soften it. "I will never be able to undo that," he said quietly. Dr. Halpern nodded. "No, you won't." The directness did not feel cruel. It felt grounding. He realized that for months, part of him had still clung to the idea that sufficient growth might cancel the past. Accepting irreversibility felt painful, but stabilizing. Later that evening, he sat alone at home, while Atlas rested nearby. He wrote another letter, not to Lena, but to himself. In it, he acknowledged that remorse was not a performance but a practice. He described the difference between fear and love, between control and care. He did not promise transformation. He promised effort. He did not store this letter in the drawer. He left it on the desk, visible. Several weeks later, he encountered Lena again, this time at a community fundraising event hosted by the shelter. The room was crowded, filled with volunteers and donors. He noticed her across the space, speaking with the shelter manager. She looked composed, comfortable. For a moment, he considered avoiding her entirely. Avoidance felt safe, but safety was no longer his only metric. He approached slowly, ensuring his posture remained open, non-intrusive. "Hi," he said when she turned toward him. She did not flinch. That absence of fear struck him more profoundly than any greeting could have. "Hi," she replied. "I heard you adopted Atlas." He nodded. "Yeah. He's teaching me patience." She gave a faint smile. "He needs that." The statement was neutral, but layered. There was a pause. Not tense, but reflective. "I've noticed a difference," she said carefully. Daniel's pulse quickened slightly, not with hope but with caution. "In what?" he asked. "In you," she answered. "You don't feel sharp anymore." The description surprised him. He had never considered that his presence once felt like a blade. "I'm trying," he said simply. She studied him for a moment longer. "Trying matters," she said. He did not interpret the exchange as reconciliation. He did not ask for more. He recognized that trust, if it ever returned in any form, would be incremental and conditional. As the evening continued, they moved through the event separately. He watched her laugh at something someone said, noticed how natural the expression seemed. The sight no longer provoked jealousy, it provoked reflection. Later that night, walking home with Atlas beside him, he considered how easily he could have interpreted her comments as an invitation to pursue closeness again. The old version of him would have. The new version recognized the difference between acknowledgement and permission. Months turned into a year. The dramatic elements of his past receded into background context rather than immediate crisis. Yet he remained vigilant. Growth felt less like climbing upward and more like balancing on unstable ground. One evening, while preparing dinner, Atlas knocked over a glass. It shattered on the kitchen floor. The sound echoed sharply, triggering a flash of memory from the bowl that had shattered the morning of the gunshot. For a split second, his chest tightened. Atlas froze, ears back, anticipating anger. Daniel noticed the dog's posture and consciously softened his own. "It's okay," he said calmly. He knelt, cleaning the glass carefully. Atlas approached hesitantly, tail low but not tucked. The moment felt small, almost insignificant, but it represented something fundamental. The sound of breaking no longer required dominance in response. Weeks later, Lena sent another brief message, this time asking whether he would be willing to share his experience in an anger management group she had joined as a volunteer advocate. The request startled him. He reread the message several times. Uncertain whether to accept, he agreed cautiously. When he entered the group session, he felt exposed in a way different from therapy. These were individuals earlier in their journeys, some defensive, some ashamed. He spoke plainly about the moment he chose fear over vulnerability, about the illusion of control. "I thought if I scared her enough, she'd stay," he said. "But fear doesn't create loyalty, it creates distance." After the session, Lena approached him. There was no romantic undercurrent in her expression, only something resembling respect. "That was honest," she said. "It had to be," he replied. They stood in silence briefly. The silence felt different now, less anticipatory, more reflective. "I'm glad you're doing the work," she said quietly. "It doesn't change what happened, but it matters." "I know," he answered. When she left, he did not feel the ache he once associated with separation. He felt something steadier. Not closure, not reunion. Something between accountability and coexistence. That night, back in his apartment, he sat beside Atlas and considered how easily his story could have ended differently. Incarceration, further violence, deeper denial. The fact that it had not did not feel like triumph. It felt like responsibility. He understood now that redemption was not a singular act. It was daily restraint. It was listening when pride demanded defense. It was recognizing that love could not be extracted through fear. He was still in the middle, not absolved, not condemned. Living with consequence, practicing restraint, aware that growth required constant choice. The story did not conclude. It persisted in small rooms, in quiet conversations, in the absence of raised voices, and he remained there, choosing, moment by moment, not to pull the trigger again in any form. The realization did not arrive with triumph. It settled slowly, like dust after something violent has finally stopped moving. He understood that the danger had never been limited to a weapon. It had lived in tone, in posture, in silence, sharpened into threat. The gun had only made visible what had always existed beneath the surface. The following months did not test him with catastrophe. They tested him with monotony. There were bills to pay, meetings to attend, groceries to buy. Atlas chewed through a pair of shoes and vomited on the rug one night after eating something he shouldn't have at the park. Daniel felt irritation flare, immediate and disproportionate. He stood in the kitchen staring at the mess, aware of how easy it would be to release that irritation in raised volume, in harsh movement. Atlas watched him cautiously, body tense, expecting escalation. Daniel exhaled slowly. "It's fine," he said, though it wasn't. He grabbed paper towels and cleaned the rug methodically. The dog's body gradually softened. The small exchange carried more weight than it appeared to. Anger had once been his reflex, his punctuation. Now it was a signal to pause. Therapy sessions eventually moved from weekly to bi-weekly. Dr. Halpern made it clear that frequency was not graduation. "Stability isn't the absence of risk," she reminded him. "It's your response to it." Daniel nodded, aware that complacency could be as dangerous as volatility. One afternoon, she asked him directly, "Do you still want her back?" The question hung between them, simple and sharp. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Months earlier, the response would have been automatic. Now he examined it carefully. "I want what we could have been," he said finally. "But I don't want to drag her back into something that required fear to function." He paused, considering his own words. If she came back because she felt safe, that would mean something. If she came back because she felt pressured, that would mean I haven't changed. Dr. Halpern nodded once. "And if she never comes back," he swallowed. "Then I live with that." The statement felt real, not performative. It did not erase longing, it placed boundaries around it. Work continued to expand his sense of identity beyond his marriage. The promotion brought new responsibilities, and with them, new stressors. Deadlines tightened, expectations increased. The old version of Daniel might have responded by tightening his grip on everyone around him. Instead, he began practicing delegation without intimidation. It was imperfect. There were moments when impatience surfaced in clipped replies or overly rigid instructions. But he noticed them sooner now, apologized when necessary, corrected course. One evening, after a long day, he found himself thinking about Lena, not with obsession, but with curiosity. He wondered what her days looked like now. Whether she still took her coffee without sugar, whether she still hummed absent-mindedly while reading. The memories no longer felt like open wounds. They felt like photographs fixed in time, not demanding alteration. At the shelter's annual meeting, the manager thanked volunteers publicly. When Daniel's name was mentioned, there was polite applause. He did not experience it as validation of his redemption. He experienced it as acknowledgement of consistency. Atlas had grown calmer over the year, less reactive, more trusting. Watching the dog interact easily with strangers, Daniel recognized that patience had reshaped both of them. After the meeting, Lena approached him again. There was no tension in her posture now, only measured familiarity. "Atlas looks good," she said. "He is," Daniel replied. "He's steady." "So are you," she observed quietly. He met her eyes, not searching for hidden invitation, not guarding against accusation. "I'm trying to be." They stood beside the kennel area. the background noise of animals and volunteers filling the silence between sentences. "I don't think about that morning every day anymore," Lena said unexpectedly. "I used to." Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly. He did not rush to respond. "I do," he admitted. "Not because I'm reliving it. Because I don't want to forget what I'm capable of." She nodded slowly. "For a long time, I thought you'd always be that version of yourself." "I thought that too," he replied. There was no dramatic reconciliation in her expression, no softened nostalgia, but there was something else: recognition. Not forgiveness as absolution, but acknowledgement of effort. "I don't hate you," she said after a moment. The words landed with more force than any declaration of love could have. "I don't hate myself anymore either," he answered carefully. "But I don't excuse myself." She considered that, then nodded once. That matters. They did not linger. She had her own life now, her own routines, her own stability separate from him. He felt no urge to insert himself into it. As she walked away, he did not experience loss. He experienced acceptance of distance. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Daniel opened the window and let in the cool air. Atlas rested near the couch, breathing steadily. The room no longer felt like a temporary holding space between identities. It felt lived in, chosen. He sat at the desk where the letter to himself still rested, now slightly worn at the edges. He reread it, noticing how the handwriting had steadied over time. The early sentences contained uncertainty, the later ones carried clarity. He added a final paragraph. "You cannot undo what you did. You cannot demand that anyone see you differently. All you can do is behave differently long enough that the difference becomes real." He placed the pen down and leaned back. Weeks later, he received an unexpected invitation to speak at a small corporate workshop about conflict management. His manager believed his experience in anger management and personal development could translate into leadership insight. The irony was not lost on him. He accepted cautiously. Standing in front of a conference room of professionals, he did not recount the gunshot in detail. He did not center himself as a cautionary spectacle. Instead, he spoke about escalation, about the illusion of control, about the difference between authority and intimidation. "When you feel threatened," he said calmly, "your instinct might be to overpower the situation. But power without restraint destroys trust. And once trust is gone, control becomes meaningless." The room listened quietly. There were questions about stress, about boundaries, about accountability. He answered without dramatics, without self-pity. After the session, a young employee approached him privately. "I have a temper," the employee admitted. "I thought it made me strong." Daniel held the gaze steadily. "It feels strong," he said. "But it's fragile. Real strength is staying when it would be easier to explode." The conversation lingered with him long after the employee left. On the second anniversary of the divorce, Daniel did not mark the date in his calendar. He only realized it in the evening when he noticed the season shifting again. The air felt similar to that day outside the courthouse. He walked Atlas through the park, watching leaves gather along the path. As he sat on a bench, he thought about the man he had been that morning in the kitchen years earlier. He did not hate him. He did not defend him. He acknowledged him as a version that had believed fear equaled love. Atlas nudged his hand gently, interrupting the spiral. Daniel scratched behind the dog's ear and exhaled slowly. "I can't change it," he murmured quietly. The statement was not resignation. It was recognition. Later that week, Lena sent one final message. It was brief, almost administrative. She was moving out of the city for a new job opportunity. She wanted to inform him before he heard it through others. He stared at the message longer than necessary. The old impulse to interpret departure as abandonment, as rejection, stirred faintly, but it did not dominate. He replied simply, "I hope it's good for you." She responded hours later, "It is." There were no promises to stay in touch, no suggestion of reunion. The exchange felt complete. That evening, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, the same place where he once spread mediation documents in panic. Atlas rested at his feet. The apartment hummed with quiet normalcy. He thought about closure, about whether it required ceremony. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no final embrace, no cinematic apology that healed everything. Instead, there had been years of small choices. He stood and walked to the mirror in the hallway. The man staring back looked familiar but altered. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not from anger, from reflection. "You don't get to forget," he said softly to his own reflection. "But you don't have to repeat." The statement settled into him with weight and steadiness. He returned to the living room and turned off the lights one by one. The apartment fell into shadow, not ominous, not anticipatory, just quiet. Atlas followed him to the bedroom, circling twice before lying down. Daniel lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. The silence no longer felt like a gathering storm. It felt like space. Space to choose differently. Space to remain accountable. Space to live without the need to dominate the narrative. The story did not resolve into perfection. It resolved into responsibility. He closed his eyes, aware that tomorrow would demand the same discipline it always had. There would be moments of irritation, moments of insecurity, moments when control would tempt him with its familiar ease. But there would also be pauses, breaths, deliberate restraint. He did not seek absolution in that quiet room. He accepted consequence as permanent and growth as ongoing. And for the first time, the absence of chaos did not feel like emptiness. It felt like peace earned slowly.